They expected the rattle of steel, the smell of coal, and the hard benches that dug into their backs. But when the German officers first laid eyes on America's troop trains, they froze in disbelief. Polished mahogany walls. Velvet seats. Silver trays carrying hot meals. Soldiers laughing, writing letters, playing cards, all while racing toward the front lines in comfort they'd never imagined existed in war. To the Germans, it felt impossible. How could a nation fighting the same brutal war afford to move its troops in luxury? Their own men were crammed into freezing cattle cars, eating stale bread under flickering lanterns. In that moment, the Americans weren't just moving soldiers, they were sending a message. A message of power, pride, and unimaginable abundance. And for the first time, the Germans realized, they weren't fighting just an army, they were fighting an empire of comfort and confidence. World War II was not only a battle of guns and tanks, it was a battle of resources, willpower, and the ability to keep men believing they could win. While Europe burned and soldiers froze in cramped boxcars, America was quietly redefining what war could look like. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. had turned its industrial might into something extraordinary, a fleet of luxury trains designed to move entire divisions in style and comfort. These were not mere troop transports. They were rolling palaces of steel and velvet, fitted with dining cars, private sleeping compartments, air conditioning, and kitchens serving fresh-cooked meals. To American soldiers, these trains were a small piece of home on wheels, a reminder that their country valued them, even in the darkest times. But to the German officers who eventually saw them, it was an unthinkable sight. A symbol that the United States wasn't just winning through weapons, it was winning through morale, through abundance, through belief. This is the story of those incredible trains, and how a simple journey across the tracks revealed the true difference between two worlds at war. When the first of these American troop trains rolled out from Chicago in 1942, the sound of the engine was not the harsh, choking scream of a freight locomotive, it was a deep, confident hum. Steam curled into the morning sky as thousands of soldiers lined the platforms, duffel bags slung over their shoulders, faces marked by anticipation and fear. They were heading to war, but for a few hours, the world around them didn't look like war at all. Polished brass gleamed in the sunlight. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and linen. Rows of cushioned seats, soft enough to sink into, stretched through cars lined with mahogany panels. The soldiers couldn't believe it. Some had never seen such comfort in their lives, not even back home. They had expected metal benches, open windows, and the endless rattling of boxcars. Instead, they stepped into something that looked more like a first-class hotel on rails. In the dining car, chefs in white uniforms prepared breakfast, eggs, bacon, pancakes, even fresh fruit. The men laughed as they sat at tables with white cloths and real silverware. For a brief moment, war felt distant, almost unreal. They were traveling toward danger, but America had made sure they did it with dignity. Outside, curious civilians gathered to watch these trains roll by. Mothers waved at the windows, children saluted, and old men tipped their hats. The trains carried not only soldiers but a message, that America was still strong, still prosperous, and that no enemy could crush its spirit. Every car had a story of its own. The Pullman Company, famous for its luxury sleepers, had repurposed its finest designs for military use. The U.S. Army had turned to them to ensure that every journey, from the training camps of Texas to the ports of New York, was efficient, fast, and comfortable. Inside each car, order reigned. Men slept in bunks with clean sheets, letters were written under soft yellow light, and songs echoed through the hallways. The soldiers talked about home, about mothers, sweethearts, and baseball. Some joked about how strange it felt to ride in style while heading into hell. Others fell silent, staring out the windows as America's vast landscapes rushed by, the wheat fields of Kansas, the snowy ridges of Pennsylvania, the industrial towers of Detroit. They were young, but the country around them felt eternal. By nightfall, the train cars glowed like lanterns in the dark, slicing through endless miles of track. The rhythmic sound of the wheels was hypnotic, steady, like the heartbeat of a nation on the move. Somewhere between sleep and fear, the men felt something rare, calm. In a war that demanded everything from them, this comfort was not just luxury, it was strategy. It reminded every soldier that he was not forgotten. That somewhere far from the front, his country cared enough to give him warmth before sending him into the cold. And when word of these trains began to spread, through photos, reports, and whispers that reached German intelligence, disbelief turned into shock. The enemy had never imagined such scenes could exist in wartime. To them, war was always dirt, exhaustion, and iron discipline. But for the Americans, it was also pride that even in the chaos of global conflict, they could afford to fight like gentlemen. The luxury trains weren't just carrying men to battle. They were carrying the soul of a nation that believed comfort and courage could ride the same rails. Behind the shimmering polish of those trains lay an operation of staggering scale, a logistical masterpiece that revealed the true depth of America's wartime power. These luxury troop trains didn't just appear overnight. They were born from a vision, that comfort could be a weapon, that morale could travel faster when wrapped in steel and velvet. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps, working hand in hand with railroad companies, transformed the nation's rail network into an artery of movement and morale. More than 200,000 miles of track crisscrossed the country, connecting every camp, factory, and port. The challenge wasn't just to move soldiers, it was to keep them human during the long, uncertain journey to the front. In early 1942, the War Department faced a problem. Hundreds of thousands of men were being drafted every month, many from rural areas far from major cities. Moving them in standard freight cars, like European armies did, would crush morale before they even reached the battlefield. The Americans knew that a soldier's mind was as vital as his rifle. If a man began his journey feeling respected, he would fight with pride. So the Pullman Company, the Santa Fe Railway, and dozens of others began reconfiguring their finest passenger cars into what they called troop sleepers and troop kitchen cars. Unlike the dark, freezing cattle wagons used by the Wehrmacht, these trains carried heating, ventilation, and lights. Each sleeper could house 30 to 40 men in neatly arranged bunks, each with clean bedding. The kitchens served thousands of meals daily, hot coffee, eggs, stew, even fresh bread baked on board. But the true genius lay in the design philosophy. America wanted its soldiers to feel valued, not expendable. The walls were lined with polished wood veneer, and curtains covered the windows for privacy. Bathrooms, unheard of in most military trains, were fully functional. The cars even had reading lamps and small foldable tables where men could write letters to loved ones. Every detail served a purpose. When a young man left his home in Kansas or Ohio, often for the first time in his life, the train became his bridge between civilian life and the war front. It was where he processed fear, said silent prayers, and learned to bond with strangers who would soon become brothers in arms. For military planners, these trains also meant efficiency. While they appeared luxurious, their engineering was strictly practical. The Army could move an entire division, over 15,000 men, across the country in a matter of days. The trains ran with near-perfect timing, refueling and restocking at pre-assigned depots that operated like clockwork. Meanwhile, in Europe, German troops were being shuttled in old freight cars marked 40 men or 8 horses. There were no beds, no heat, no comfort. Soldiers huddled together in freezing darkness, eating cold rations from tins. Many froze to death before reaching the front. To them, war was movement through misery. To the Americans, war was movement through organization. The Germans had built their empire on fear and discipline. The Americans built theirs on belief and abundance. One relied on obedience, the other on optimism. When the German High Command first received reports describing luxury troop trains in the U.S., they dismissed them as propaganda. But later, When captured soldiers spoke of dining cars, soft bunks, and even pianos in officer compartments, the disbelief turned to a kind of grim respect. They realized that America's power was not just industrial, it was psychological. The ability to make men feel important even in uniform was something the Nazi regime could never replicate. In Germany, soldiers were tools of the state. In America, they were sons of a nation that promised to bring them home. Behind every mile of those shining rails was a quiet declaration of superiority, not of cruelty or dominance, but of spirit. The trains carried no gold, no trophies, only men who believed they were part of something larger and more decent than destruction. And that belief, forged in comfort and carried in motion, was one of America's greatest secret weapons. It could not be bombed, sabotaged, or starved. It traveled from coast to coast, echoing in the rhythm of steel wheels and whispered prayers, a moving symbol of a nation that fought not only to win, but to remain human in a world that was losing its soul. When news of these American troop trains began to filter through Europe, the German military command didn't believe it at first. Reports intercepted by intelligence officers spoke of luxurious trains carrying American soldiers across the United States, complete with dining cars, soft bedding, and even entertainment. The idea seemed absurd to men who had spent the war watching their own soldiers packed like livestock into cold, creaking boxcars. But the evidence kept coming. German agents stationed in Latin America, Switzerland, and even neutral Sweden began sending back accounts from American newspapers and travelers. Photographs emerged, young soldiers leaning out of spotless railcars, smiling, waving, well-fed. The Reich's intelligence analysts examined every image in disbelief. How could a country fighting a global war afford such extravagance? How could soldiers on the brink of battle look so clean, so comfortable, so alive? Inside the German High Command, the reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the stories as propaganda designed to demoralize the Axis. Others, particularly the officers who had fought on the Eastern Front, recognized something deeper, a reflection of power. To move men in luxury was not vanity. It was confidence. It was a statement that America had such overwhelming resources, it could afford to make war feel civilized. Colonel Wilhelm Korff, an officer in German intelligence, reportedly remarked, "If their soldiers ride to war in such comfort, what must their factories look like?" His words spread through the corridors of the Abwehr like a whisper of dread. For a military machine already strained by fuel shortages and shattered supply lines, the idea that America had turned its entire railroad network into a moving fortress of morale was terrifying. German officers who later became prisoners of war confirmed the impression. When they were shipped to U.S. camps by train, many of them sat in stunned silence. Instead of the filth and darkness they expected, they found themselves in clean compartments with cushioned benches and fresh air. They were given coffee, sandwiches, even newspapers. For men raised in the harsh discipline of the Wehrmacht, it felt like humiliation disguised as hospitality. Some POWs wrote in their diaries about the shock. One German sergeant captured in Normandy described it vividly: "We were treated better on the train to the camp than our own soldiers were treated going to the front." It was unthinkable. Another officer wrote, "Now I understand why we will lose. Their soldiers are not slaves. They are citizens." Back in Germany, propaganda ministers tried to counter the narrative. They released stories describing American soldiers as soft and spoiled, claiming that the comforts of home would make them weak in real combat. But as the war dragged on, and as reports of American efficiency and morale spread, even loyal officers began to question the message. They saw that luxury, in this context, was not weakness, it was strength. It proved that America could feed, clothe, and transport millions of men while still maintaining a standard of living far beyond anything the Axis could offer. The contrast became symbolic. While German soldiers ate black bread and watered soup in frozen trenches, American GIs were being served full breakfasts on their way to war. The German trains reeked of sweat and despair, the American trains smelled of coffee and clean linen. That difference, the difference between desperation and dignity, carried more power than any weapon. For those who studied warfare, it was a revelation. Germany's empire of discipline was crumbling under its own brutality, while America's empire of abundance was only getting stronger. Each train that rolled across the U.S. was more than transport. It was a declaration that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that compassion could outlast cruelty. In the years that followed, captured German officers would often recall that moment of realization, when they finally understood that they were not fighting a nation of amateurs, but an industrial titan wrapped in humanity. A country that could wage total war without losing its soul. And for many of them, that realization didn't come from the battlefield. It came from the rhythmic sound of an American train, gliding smoothly toward victory, carrying soldiers who believed that even in war, comfort was not a sin. It was proof that they still remembered what they were fighting for. To outsiders, those American trains were marvels of engineering and organization. But to the men who rode them, they meant something far more profound. They were symbols of what the United States stood for, a promise that even in war, dignity would not be sacrificed. Soldiers boarded those trains with fear in their hearts, but as the wheels began to turn and the cars filled with warmth and light, something changed inside them. They felt human again. For many, it was their last taste of peace. They didn't know if they would ever return home, but for that brief journey, America wrapped them in comfort and pride. It wasn't luxury for the sake of luxury, it was a deliberate act of reassurance. Every warm meal, every clean sheet, every cup of coffee was a silent message from the nation: we see you. We value you. You matter. In the letters soldiers sent from those trains, a pattern emerged. They didn't just write about fear or duty, they wrote about gratitude. One corporal from Michigan described how the dining car reminded him of his mother's kitchen. Another from Alabama said the softness of the bed felt like sleeping inside hope. For men marching toward uncertainty, these small moments of grace became anchors. They reminded them that they were fighting not for conquest, but for a way of life, a way that valued comfort, decency, and compassion even amid chaos. American commanders understood this psychology deeply. General Dwight D. Eisenhower once remarked that morale was the spark that fuels victory. He believed that soldiers who felt respected would fight harder and longer than those treated as expendable. The trains embodied that principle. They turned logistics into loyalty, and transportation into transformation. Across the ocean, the German officers could not comprehend it. In their system, soldiers were tools, instruments of the state's will. Comfort was weakness, and individuality was dangerous. But America's approach was different. It was democratic even in war. Every soldier, no matter his rank or origin, sat in the same cars, ate the same food, and shared the same journey. That equality was a quiet revolution, one that terrified the Nazi hierarchy more than any tank. The symbolism ran deep. These luxury trains were more than just metal and wood, they were moving monuments to freedom. They told every man aboard that civilization didn't have to vanish in war. Where other nations turned inward, embracing brutality, the U.S. looked outward, choosing compassion as a weapon. It was a kind of moral armor, protecting the spirit as much as the body. And when those trains stopped at ports or airfields, their passengers stepped off not as weary recruits but as believers. They carried the scent of coffee, the memory of music from the lounge car, and the echo of laughter shared over long miles of track. They carried America itself, its comfort, its optimism, its defiance, into the heart of battle. In time, those who survived would look back and realize that the luxury had not softened them. It had strengthened them. It had reminded them what they were fighting to preserve. The taste of a real meal, the feel of clean sheets, the warmth of light, all of it stood in stark contrast to the darkness they would soon face overseas. Long after the war ended, many veterans still remembered those journeys as vividly as the battles themselves. Some would say that the train rides gave them courage, others called them the calm before the storm. But all agreed on one thing: they proved that America cared. And that was the secret the Germans never understood. The trains were not built to boast or to intimidate, they were built to reassure. They showed that in a world drowning in violence, one nation still believed in kindness. That belief, more than any weapon, was what made America unstoppable. Because sometimes, the most powerful message a nation can send is not through its guns or its bombs, but through the quiet comfort of a journey that reminds its soldiers they are still human. When the war finally ended and the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific, the tracks that had carried millions of soldiers to battle fell silent. The luxury troop trains, once roaring symbols of motion and might, stood idle in the rail yards, their engines cold, their lights dimmed. But their legacy did not fade. For years, veterans would speak of those journeys with the same reverence they gave to battlefield memories. They remembered not just the destinations but the feeling of the ride itself, the laughter in the dining cars, the smell of hot coffee, the gentle sway of the train rocking them toward destiny. In those fleeting hours, they were reminded of what they were fighting for, the right to live with dignity, even in the face of destruction. After the war, many of those trains were repurposed or sold. Some became hospital cars, bringing wounded heroes home. Others were converted into passenger services once again, carrying civilians through the same landscapes once watched by young soldiers heading to war. A few were preserved in museums, their polished brass and wooden interiors gleaming like time capsules of faith and endurance. Each one stands today as a silent monument to a powerful truth, that even in the darkest chapter of history, humanity can survive in the smallest gestures. For the German officers who had once mocked the idea of comfort in war, the lesson came too late. They had seen what America's luxury meant, not softness, but spirit. Those trains carried more than troops, they carried an idea, an identity. They showed that democracy could be organized, that kindness could be disciplined, and that victory could be achieved without abandoning compassion. Every mile those trains traveled was a testament to the American belief that strength is not found only in muscle or machinery, but in meaning. The gleam of metal, the hum of the rails, the laughter of soldiers in uniform, it was all part of a grander message to the world, that power built on humanity will always outlast power built on fear. As time passes, the soldiers who once rode those trains grow fewer, their memories fading into history. But the story of the luxury troop trains endures, not just as a tale of transportation, but as a reminder of what made that generation truly great. Because in the end, those trains didn't just move men to war. They carried a nation's soul, forward, unstoppable, and unbroken.